Imagine this. Four Liverpool boys are trying to make a name for themselves in the local music scene in the early 1960s. The Beatles, which consist of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo, are practicing their sound at seedy bars while aspiring to be famous. Brian Epstein, a well-dressed manager, saw the untapped potential in the unkempt band. There was more to his potential than cavern club appearances. He assured them of everything. Epstein appeared to be their key to achieving all of their goals for a while. However, conflicts and mistrust were seething behind Beatlemania's glittering exterior. Ultimately, Epstein's decisions, both personal and professional, would result in a sense of betrayal that continues to reverberate throughout music history. Brian Epstein entered Liverpool's Cavern Club for the first time in November 1961. Imagine the scene. Cigarette smoke, wet air, and the electrifying energy of the audience filled the room. Wearing leather jackets, the Beatles were a bit rough. However, Epstein recognized a unique quality in them, a charm that might be shaped into popular success. Epstein, who owned a family-run record business called Nem's North End Music Stores, was from an affluent background, in contrast to other local managers. He was polished, driven, and ready to establish himself in the music industry. Epstein persuaded the Beatles that he could improve their reputation and increase their fan base. He requested that they wear the recognizable mop-top haircuts and switch from leather to fitted suits in order to tidy up their appearance. And the band gambled on him after realizing the potential of larger stages. Soon after, producer George Martin helped him land their first recording deal with Parlophone. When the Beatles released Love Me Do in 1962, everyone started to take notice. Epstein fulfilled his commitments. More than the Beatles could have guessed, maybe. They were at the top of the UK charts by 1963, and Beatlemania had swept the United States by 1964. Every Beatles record seemed to turn to gold during that time, when teenage females fainted at the sight of the band. Epstein scheduled their press interviews, booked them into storied venues like Carnegie Hall, and oversaw their busy schedules. As the man behind the scenes who pulled the strings that made the Beatles a worldwide sensation, he appeared to be the fifth Beatle. However, as the band's popularity increased, flaws started to appear. Once a strength, Epstein's business sense was now a liability. His passion for leading the Beatles was unparalleled, but his knowledge of the legal complexities of the music business was lacking. Epstein negotiated arrangements that would eventually turn out to be less than ideal as offers came in from both sides. Hasty merchandise deals resulted in large earnings being given to other parties. Epstein made a notorious agreement that would cost the band millions of dollars as their reputation soared. He signed away the rights to Beatles products in the United States for a meager 10% fee. Consider this moment. The now famous Beatles became aware that they were losing millions of dollars. After acting as the band's guardian, Epstein had committed a string of financially disastrous errors that were nearly difficult to undo. The influx of products, lunchboxes, toys, wigs, posters, and anything else that could be named continued along with Beatlemania. However, the Beatles only received a small portion of the money made from these products. The rest went to other people. Early in their career, Epstein arranged recording contracts, but even these were not as favorable as they could have been. In contrast to the enormous sales they were making, the Beatles' original contract with EMI only offered them a tiny royalty rate. When the band was still unknown, these contracts might have made sense, but as their fame grew, it became obvious that they had taken on too much. Behind the scenes, animosity grew as the band members became aware of how much Epstein's choices were costing them. But the feeling of betrayal wasn't limited to business choices. The disintegration of Brian Epstein's relationship with the Beatles was largely caused by his personal issues. He lived a life of dread and secrecy because he was a closeted gay man during a period when homosexuality was outlawed in Britain. Epstein's loneliness and worry frequently caused him to engage in unsafe behaviors, such as seeking relationships in hazardous settings and battling drug addiction, especially to stimulants and barbiturates. He struggled to keep the poise required of a manager leading the world's largest band because of his brittle emotional state. Being conscious of his difficulties, the Beatles displayed some empathy, but it also made their relationship more difficult. The tension was increased by John Lennon's occasionally hurtful comments regarding Epstein's sexual orientation. Rumor had it that Epstein's feelings occasionally affected his decision-making. He may have overlooked better offers or acted rashly in the band's favor because of his strong bond with them and need for their acceptance. The band started to view him more as a man out of his depth and less as a mentor as they became more self-reliant, battling to control his inner demons as well as the intricacies of their rapidly rising stardom. The Beatles were worn out by 1966 from touring and the mayhem that accompanied them everywhere. That year, they decided to stop touring, which was a game-changer for Epstein as well as the band. Epstein had excelled at touring, managing the logistics, planning shows, and maintaining the band's visibility. However, since live performances were no longer an option, the band withdrew to the studio to pursue new musical endeavors. While albums like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and Revolver demonstrated their development as musicians, they also marked a departure from the framework Epstein had established around them. Epstein had a hard time fitting in during this new stage. As the Beatles took command of their own creative direction, working more closely with producer George Martin and separating themselves from Epstein's commercial oversight, his influence over their daily lives diminished. Epstein's confidence decreased and his substance misuse deteriorated. None of the new acts he attempted to manage ever achieved the Beatles' level of success. Despite their continued respect for him, the group started making decisions without his input and independence, which Epstein found difficult to accept. It's likely that you've heard about the August 1967 discovery of Brian Epstein's body in his London residence. Barbiturate overdose was the official cause. However, there has always been conjecture regarding the precise cause of his death, intentional or unintentional. The news was heartbreaking for the Beatles. Even though they were getting more apart, Epstein's passing left them unprepared for the world without the man who had supported them when no one else did. "I knew we were in trouble then," John Lennon subsequently acknowledged. "I had no misunderstandings regarding our capabilities beyond just performing music." The Beatles went through a difficult time after Epstein's passing. Without his direction, they started their disastrous company, Apple Corps, and got caught up in financial and legal issues that made their relationships even more strained. They could never fully fill the vacuum left by his departure. The Beatles struggled with Brian Epstein's legacy in the years following his tragic death, and their thoughts of the man who had previously served as their inspiration were tinged with a mixture of remorse and appreciation. Imagine a band at the top of the world, remembering the guy who made it possible for them to achieve such incredible heights, but also remembering the dangers that came with their success. The eternally tactful Paul McCartney frequently discussed Epstein's impact with admiration. He acknowledged that without Epstein, the Beatles could never have achieved worldwide fame and gave him credit for helping to shape their early success. McCartney realized that they had been given opportunities by Epstein's poise and professionalism, doors that the tenacious young Liverpool band would not have been able to open on their own. Beneath the thankfulness, however, was a feeling of disappointment, a persistent conviction that Epstein's lack of expertise had cost them a great deal of money. Paul's contemplations frequently sounded like wishful thinking. He was aware that they had lost millions as a result of Epstein's choice to give up the merchandising rights. However, he also acknowledged the human component, the notion that Epstein was learning as he went along, just like them. Nevertheless, despite his appreciation of Epstein's achievements, there was an implicit acknowledgement of the instances in which Epstein's personal hardships had impairing his judgment. Imagine the band soaring higher than any previous performance, only to discover that they had been exposed to the guy in charge's limitations. John Lennon, who was becoming less romantic and more straightforward, went right to the heart of his conflicted emotions. He had a reputation for voicing his opinions, and his description of Epstein's administration as a double-edged blade was both a criticism and an admission of their common past. Lennon was aware that Epstein had elevated them from Liverpool's gritty clubs to international stardom, but he also experienced a deep sense of betrayal due to Epstein's poor management of contract decisions, which, even though they weren't intentional, seemed to Lennon like careless acts. It seems that in his sincere efforts to shield and advance them, Epstein had occasionally exposed them to transactions that would enrich others. For a man like Lennon, who valued loyalty and honesty above all else, it was a harsh reality. Deeper feelings of desertion were alluded to in Lennon's musings, which were sometimes tinged with bitterness. Despite his bluster, John realized that Epstein's mentoring had given him a sense of purpose. Acting as a kind of father figure during the turbulent early years of the Beatles' stardom. The band's newfound independence wasn't enough to fill the vacuum left by Epstein's departure because that anchor was also gone. Consider the late-night discussions about their late manager, Lennon and McCartney, two key members of the Beatles' creative core who alternated between being thankful for the guy who had supported them and being angry at the ways he had let them down. There is more to the story of Brian Epstein and the Beatles than just a manager and his group. The story is full of human intricacies, blunders, and the mixed feelings that accompany a strong but flawed relationship. There was no denying Epstein's devotion to the Beatles. He had a passion for them that extended beyond business. He was not merely putting on a show, he was documenting a phenomenon in culture. But occasionally, his passion made him oblivious to the subtler aspects of the inner workings of the industry. Their early image was designed by him, the man who thought the Beatles might be more than just a well-liked Liverpool band, and who urged they exchange their leather jackets for suits. They might become global celebrities. However, in his haste to advance them, he occasionally failed to consider the complexities of the agreements that would determine their financial destiny. Thus, the band's feeling of betrayal is nuanced and multi-layered. The tale of a management exploiting his artists is not straightforward. Instead, it's a story of the inadvertent mismanagement of a man whose aspirations for his band outweighed his awareness of the brutality of the industry. Epstein made well-intentioned but ultimately bad choices because he wanted to see the Beatles flourish. Additionally, even though the Beatles realized their faults, they still felt as though they had missed out on chances that could have altered their course in life. Despite their sadness, the Beatles' enthusiasm for Epstein's faith in their abilities is undeniable. According to Paul McCartney, Epstein's passing signaled the start of their demise, from which they would never fully bounce back. Losing a manager was not the only thing at stake. Losing the man who initially regarded them as more than just another Liverpool band was the main concern. The Beatles had the confidence to believe in themselves because Epstein believed in them, and that belief was more valuable than any contract in many respects. Imagine the Beatles standing together in the studio years after Epstein's passing, knowing that they were losing their creative collaboration. The suits, the yelling masses, and even their own childish aspirations had become outdated. Still, the shadow of Epstein's disappearance lingered in the air, the man who had been their anchor. It served as a reminder that no matter how far they went, they would always be unable to completely escape the decisions and connections that had influenced their ascent. In the end, the Beatles and Brian Epstein's narrative serves as a lesson that songs alone are never enough to achieve success in the music business. It's about the individuals who wrote those songs, their aspirations, imperfections, and occasionally their betrayals. It's a tale where appreciation and bitterness may coexist, and where the pain of missed chances is not lessened by thankfulness. Ultimately, the Beatles' relationship with Brian Epstein serves as one of the most moving reminders in rock history that even the most profound bonds are frequently characterized by ambiguities and contradictions.